You are listening to PastThink.com audiobook. Please like and subscribe, thank you. Chapter 81. For young ladies go fishing and divine the future. Bao Yu receives a homily and is re-enrolled in the family school. To continue our story. After Ingchun's departure, Lady Xing continued as though nothing had happened. It was Lady Wang who had gone out of her way to be kind, and her sympathy was genuine and deeply felt. In the morning, when Bao Yu came to her apartment to pay his respects, he found her alone, sighing pensively to herself. He thought he could see traces of tears on her cheeks, and not wanting to intrude, stood to one side. When she told him to sit down, he sidled up onto the Kong and settled down next to her. He lapsed at once into a silent stare, and she could tell that he had something on his mind. Well, and what are you looking so glum for? Nothing really. I just can't stop thinking about Cousin Ing. It's so awful. I haven't mentioned it to Granny, but I haven't been able to sleep properly for 2 nights now. How helpless and defenseless she must feel, especially after growing up in a family like ours. She's so weak too, and never could stand up for herself properly. Why should she of all people have to fall into the hands of such a bully, someone who'll never be able to give her the sort of tenderness and understanding she needs? He was on the verge of tears. It is hard, I know, said Lady Wang. But as they say, marry a daughter, throw out the water. At this stage, what is there I could possibly do? I've thought of something, replied Bao Yu somewhat unexpectedly. It came to me last night. If we report the whole thing to Granny, we can get her permission to fetch Ing and move her back to Amaryllis Ayat. Why not? She'll be able to lead her old carefree life, we'll all be together again, and that Mr. Sun can go to hell and take his temper with him. If he dares to try and ask for her back, we'll simply refuse to let her go. He can come 100 times, we'll never give in. We'll just say that it's Granny's orders, and he won't be able to do a thing. Don't you think it's a brilliant plan? My dear child, exclaimed Lady Wang, her voice registering both amusement and motherly vexation at this effusion. There you go again, carried away by yet another of your silly ideas. How can you be so hopelessly naive? Can't you see that sooner or later every girl has to leave home, and that once she's married her own family has no business to interfere? She must look to her own future. If fate has been kind to her, well and good. If not, she must learn to live with it all the same. You must know the old rhyme. When rooster crows at break of day, all his henfolk must obey. No choice for a dog's wife, but to make the best of a dog's life. Not all the girls can be called to court like your elder sister, you know. Besides, Ing is still an inexperienced wife, and her husband a young man. Their temperaments differ, and if at this early stage they don't get on very well together, that's only to be expected. Given time, when they've both learned to understand one another better, and have a family of their own, things will sort themselves out, I'm sure they will. You're certainly not to breathe a word of this to your grandmother. If I discover that you have, I shall be extremely cross. Now off you go, I've heard quite enough of your nonsense. Realizing that his mother was adamant, Bao Yu sat there a while longer in silence, then walked listlessly out of the room. Choking with frustration, he made his way back to the garden and straight to the Naiad's house. The instant he entered the door, he let out a great wail and burst into tears. Dai Yu, who had only just that minute finished washing and putting up her hair, was shocked to see the state he was in and asked in some alarm. Whatever's the matter? Who's upset you? Bao Yu, however, was already slumped over the table, sobbing his heart out, and far too distraught to reply to her questions. From her chair Dai Yu studied him anxiously for a while, before asking again. Well, at least let me know if I'm the culprit or not. That's not it. It's nothing like that, he replied at last, with a despairing motion of his hand. Then why the tears and everything? I just think the sooner we all die the better. There's no joy left in life. What do you mean? Have you gone quite mad? I'm not in the slightest mad. Let me explain and I'm sure you'll feel as I do. When Ing was here, you saw how she looked, you heard everything she said, didn't you? Why is it that the minute they're grown up, girls are married off and have to suffer so? When I think of the happy times we all had together, when we first started the Crabflower Club, always inviting each other round for parties, and holding poetry contests, there seemed no end of wonderful things to do. And now? Bao has already moved out, which means Caltrip can't come over either, and with Ing gone as well, our band of kindred spirits is being broken up, everything is being spoiled. I had thought of a plan, to get Granny on our side and rescue Ing. But when I told Mother, she just called me naive and silly and wouldn't take me seriously. So I had to give up the idea. You only have to look around you. Our garden's altered so much in such a short time. What could become of it in the next few years just doesn't bear thinking about. Now do you see what I mean, and why I can't help despairing? As she listened to all that he was saying, Dayu very slowly bowed her head, and moved back almost imperceptibly onto the Kong. She did not say a word, but only sighed and curled up facing the wall. This was how Nightingale found them when she came in to serve tea. Her attempts to puzzle out what could have happened were cut short by the arrival of Aroma. So this is where you are, she said as she came into the room. You're wanted at her old ladyship's, Master Bao. I thought I'd find you here. Recognizing Aroma's voice, Dayu sat up a little and nodded to her to sit down. Bao noticed that her eyes were red from crying. I got a bit carried away, cuz, he said. Please don't take it to heart so. What you must do is look after yourself properly and get fit and well. And when I say that, I mean it. So have a rest now. I'm wanted at Granny's. I'll be back. With these words he set off. What's up with you two then? Whispered Aroma. Oh, he's upset about Miss Ing, Dayu replied. I'm all right. My eyes have been itching and I've been rubbing them, that's all. Aroma said nothing and hurried out after Bao. He reached Grandmother Jia's only to find that she had already retired for her midday nap, and was obliged to go back to Green Delights. In the afternoon he woke from his sleep feeling very bored, and picked up a book to read. Aroma hurried off to make tea, eager to sustain him in his studies. He had chanced upon an anthology of early verse, and as he turned its pages found himself reading a stanza by Cao Cao. Come drink with me and sing. For life's a fleeting thing. Full many a day has fled. Like the morning dew. Far from distracting him, this only served to increase his ennui, and he put the book down and picked up another. This time it was The Gathering at Orchid Pavilion, and other prose selections from the Jin dynasty. After a page or two he suddenly closed it, and when Aroma returned with his tea, she found him sitting there, head propped on hand, looking his most dazed and distant. Why have you given up so soon? She asked. Bao took his tea without a word of reply, drank a sip, then mechanically replaced the cup. Aroma was out of her depth and could do nothing but stand there dumbly looking on. Suddenly he stood up and muttered sarcastically. Ob gem-like ecstasy. Aroma half wanted to laugh, but on reflection thought it safer not to probe too far. If you don't feel like reading, she suggested tactfully, why not go for a walk in the garden? There's no sense in sitting here and working yourself up into one of your states again. Bao mumbled something in reply and walked abstractedly out of the room. He soon came to Drenched Blossoms Pavilion and gazed out over the lake. All around him he saw nothing but dereliction and decay. Walking on, he reached All Spice Court, which was locked and shuttered. Only its rockery was still tenanted by the familiar herbs and creepers. He was just turning to go on past the Lotus Pavilion, when something caught his eye. Looking across the water, he could just distinguish a small group of people leaning over the stone balustrade on Smartweed Bank, and some maids down below, squatting on their heels and apparently searching for something. He darted behind a large rock and crept up on them, listening all the while. Will it come up? Will it? He thought he recognized the voice of Li Wan's cousin, Li Wan. Then came a laugh. There. It's gone. You see, I told you it wouldn't bite. There was no mistaking Tan Chun's voice. Of course it won't if you keep moving about like that, Wan. Look. It's going to. The last two voices were those of Li Wen's younger sister Qi, and Lady Xing's niece Xiaoyan. Such an opportunity was altogether too tempting. Picking a brickbat from the ground, Bao Yu lobbed it into the water right in front of the four girls. There was a resounding splash, and they jumped for their lives, with cries of, "What the? Who's that trying to give us a scare? Of all the mean." A beaming Bao Yu sprang from his hiding place. "Having a lovely time, are you? And why wasn't I invited, pray?" It was Tan Chun who replied. Typical. I knew it. That had Bao Yu written all over it. Well, I'm not going to waste my breath scolding you, just hurry up and catch us another fish to make up for that one. It was practically on the hook when you had to come along and scare it away. Not likely, said Bao Yu with a grin. Here you are on a fishing excursion and leaving me out, it's you who owe me a penalty. Everyone laughed. I know, he went on. As we're all fishing today, why don't we try a round of fateful fish? It's very simple. If you catch a fish it means a year of good luck, and if you don't a year of bad luck. Come on, who's going to have first go? Tan Chun offered the rod to Li Wan, but she declined. Oh well, said Tan Chun, it looks as if I'll have to start. She turned to Bao Yu. If you scare mine away again, brother, you'll be for it. I only wanted to make you all jump. You'll be perfectly safe this time, I promise. Tan Chun cast her line, and in just a few seconds a little leaf wriggler swallowed the hook, and down went the float. She pulled in and landed her catch, alive and jumping. Scribe, after a lot of scrambling about, managed to get a grip on the thing, and carrying it over in both hands, placed it carefully in a little earthenware jar of fresh water. Tan Chun passed the rod on to Wan. She too felt a tug on the line almost immediately, and pulled in excitedly, only to find nothing on the hook. She cast out again, and this time stood there angling for ages. At last the line tautened, and she pulled in again. Another false alarm. She picked up the hook to examine it, and discovered that it was buckled. No wonder I couldn't catch anything. She laughed and without more ado told Candida to straighten it out for her, put on some fresh bait, and fasten on the reed float securely. This time after only a few minutes, down went the float, in she pulled with great determination, and there it was, a little 2-inch silver carp. Delighted, she turned to Bao Yu. You next. Qi and Xiaoyan must go first, replied Bao Yu. I insist. Xiaoyan was silent. You go first, cousin Bao, protested Qi. As she spoke a big bubble popped on the water. Come on, cried Tan Chun. There's no need to overdo it. Look, the fish are all over there by you, Qi. You have a go quickly. Qi took the rod with a giggle of embarrassment. Sure enough, down went her float, and she had a catch first time. Xiaoyan was the last of the girls to have her turn. She caught one and passed the rod back to Tan Chun, who handed it on to Bao Yu. I shall follow in the footsteps of old Sire Jiang, he declared. Straight was his hook. His bait a single grain. Yet of their own accord. The fish unto him came. Walking solemnly down the jetty, he sat at the water's edge in the pose of the fisherman sage. Unfortunately, at the approach of this human shadow, the fish took refuge in the far end of the pond, and for all his exertions in the higher art of angling, a long time seemed to pass without the slightest sign of a bite. When once a fish did venture near, and deigned to blow a few bubbles near the bank, he jerked the rod and scared it away. Oh dear, he sighed. It's no good. The trouble is that I'm so confoundedly impatient, and the fish are so slow on the uptake. We must be incompatible. I shall never catch anything at this rate. Come on now, help me. Feel yourself being drawn, there's my brave little fish. There was a peal of laughter from the girls. Then, before anyone could say a word, the line was seen to move a fraction. A bite at last. The sage yanked in for all he was worth. The rod crashed into a protruding rock and broke clean in two. The line snapped, and the hook, with whatever it may or may not have secured, sank without trace. This final stroke of virtuosity had his audience in stitches. Tan Chun called out, "I've never seen such a clumsy fool." As she was speaking, who should come rushing up but Musk, in a state of great excitement. "Master Bao, her old ladyship has woken up and wants to see you at once." The five of them exchanged startled glances. "But what about?" asked Tan Chun. "I don't know," replied Musk. "All I heard was something about a scandalous revelation they want to question Master Bao about. They've asked Mrs. Lien to come and answer questions as well." Bao Yu stood for a moment in stunned silence. Eventually he said, "I wonder which poor maid is in for the high jump this time." "We've no idea what it's about," said Tan Chun, "so Bao, you'd better go straight away, and as soon as you've any news, send Musk over to let us know." The four girls went their way, and Bao Yu set off for Grandmother Jia's apartment. He arrived to find her in the middle of a game of cards with Lady Wang, and realized to his relief that it could be nothing as serious as he had feared. Grandmother Jia saw him come in and asked him, "Bao darling, do you remember last year, when you were so seriously ill, and those two holy men, that mad-looking monk, and that lame Taoist, came and cured you, in the nick of time? What did the illness feel like?" Bao Yu reflected for a moment. "I can remember how it started. I was standing in my room when suddenly someone seemed to come from behind and ram something hard, like a wooden bar, up against the back of my head. It hurt like anything, my eyes started throbbing and everything went pitch black. All I could see in the room was a mob of green-faced devils with huge fangs, carrying swords and cudgels. I went to lie down on the Kong, but then it felt as if I had tight bands round my head, and the pain became so excruciating that I no longer knew what was happening. I remember how I got better. There was a ray of golden light from the hall outside my room that shone right onto my bed. The devils just took to their heels and vanished. They seemed scared of the light. My headache went away and I felt quite myself again." "You see," exclaimed Grandmother Jia, turning to Lady Wang. "It ties in perfectly." As she was speaking, Shi Feng entered the room and greeted first Grandmother Jia, then Lady Wang. "What did you want to ask me about, Granny?" she asked. "Tell me," replied Grandmother Jia, "can you recall that nasty attack you had last year?" Shi Feng laughed. "Not very clearly. The main thing I remember about it is that I was possessed. There was someone manipulating me, filling my head with the most bloodthirsty intentions. I had a terrible urge to grab hold of everything in sight and kill it. I was exhausted, but I couldn't stop." "And then?" asked Grandmother Jia. "When you were cured?" "There was a voice," replied Shi Feng, "that seemed to speak to me from nowhere. But what it said I honestly can't remember." "That settles it," exclaimed the old lady. "That's exactly the sort of thing she got up to. So it was her doing, it must have been. Oh. How could the old woman sink so low, and Bao Yu's own godmother too? Gracious Lord, to think that if those two holy men had not arrived in time, he might easily have died. And we still have not repaid them." "But Granny," asked Shi Feng, "what made you think of all this in the first place?" "Ask your aunt," replied Grandmother Jia. "I've done enough of the talking." Lady Wang took over the story. "Serjing told us when he was here this morning. Apparently Bao Yu's godmother, Mother Ma, is an evil old woman and a practicing witch. As the result of certain scandalous revelations, she's been arrested by the secret police and sent to the central jail. I should imagine she's been sentenced to death by now." The whole thing started the other day, when a Mr. Pan Sanbao informed against her. He had been trying to sell a property to a pawnbroker across the street. His price had already risen by several 100%, and when he asked for more the pawnbroker backed out. So, in an attempt to salvage his sale, Mr. Pan hired the services of our mother-ma, whom he knew to be a regular visitor at the pawnshop and intimate with all the womenfolk there. She duly succeeded, by some evil means, in throwing the pawnbroker's wife into a convulsion. Then, waiting until the attack reached alarming proportions, she had the effrontery to arrive in person, claiming to possess a patent cure for the affliction. And sure enough, after a few burnt offerings of her paper charms, paper money, and so forth, the wife recovered, and the witch coolly demanded a dozen, or so taels of silver for her services in exorcising her own spell. But nothing escapes the watchful eye of the good Lord Buddha, continued Lady Wang. Her detection and downfall were already close at hand. That same day, in her haste to leave the pawnbroker's premises, she inadvertently dropped a silk bundle. The pawnbroker picked it up, took a look inside, and noticed a number of paper figures and 4 unusually potent cakes of incense. He became suspicious, and when the old woman returned to recover her bundle he seized her, and subjected her to a quick search. He discovered hidden on her person a casket containing 2 ivory statuettes, a male and a female, both completely naked, you know, those pocket-sized figures of the devil they use, and 7 red embroidery needles. She was taken straight to the secret police, and when questioned revealed her intimate connections with the mistresses and young ladies of several eminent and wealthy families. The case was reported to the highest authorities, and her house was searched. They found quite a few clay figures of those horrible spectral furies and several boxes of narcotic incense, also, hanging in a hidden compartment behind the Kong, a 7-star lamp with all kinds of straw effigies spread below it, some with bands round their heads, others with nails through their chests or padlocks round their necks. She had a whole cupboard full of spare paper figures, and there were account slips all over the floor, listing families dealt with and amounts outstanding, together with records of goodness knows how much money received for oil and incense. Our attacks were definitely her doing, exclaimed Shifeng. I remember now. It was after we recovered, when the old witch came to visit Aunt Xiao a couple of times to collect her contributions. Something horrible seemed to come over her when she saw me. She went pale, and there was a nasty look in her eyes. I wondered what it meant at the time, but I just couldn't see any reason for her to cause trouble. After what you've just said, though, it all makes sense. With my responsibilities I can't help making enemies, and some of them are bound to try and get their own back somehow or other. But who could bear a grudge against Baoyu? That must be pure malice. Or jealousy, suggested Grandmother Jia, because she knows I'm not as fond of Huan as I am of Baoyu. Perhaps that's why she tried to harm you both. Anyway, said Lady Wang, as the old woman is already in prison, we won't be able to call on her to testify, and without her evidence we will never be able to make Aunt Xiao confess. Besides, we simply can't have the family involved in a scandal of this sort. We must bide our time. She is certain to give herself away sooner or later. You're quite right, Grandmother Jia complimented Lady Wang. In cases like this it is so hard to prove anything without conclusive evidence. We must just be thankful that the all-seeing Lord Buddha and his bodhisattvas have kept our 2 from harm. There. It's all over. And please, Feng, don't ever bring the subject up again. You can both stay and have dinner with me. She turned to Faithful and Amber. Tell them we are ready to be served. The old lady's parting shot did not go unnoticed by Shifeng, who laughed and said, So now I'm the one that set you worrying, am I? Lady Wang laughed at them both. Meanwhile the waiting women were standing expectantly outside the door, and Shifeng told the junior maids that she and Lady Wang were staying to dinner, and that they could commence service. As she was speaking, Silver came in with a message for Lady Wang from Sir Zheng. He had mislaid something, and would she go over after dinner and help him find it? You'd better go now, said Grandmother Jia. You never know, it might be something important. Yes, Mother. Leaving Shifeng to hold the fort, Lady Wang walked over to her own apartment. A brief search soon revealed the missing item. Has Ingchen gone back yet? Jiajing asked her in the course of conversation. How is she getting on with the sons? The poor girl could do nothing but cry while she was here, replied Lady Wang. She says her husband is an absolute monster. Jiajing sighed as she told him Ingchen's sad tale. I knew they were unsuited, he commented. But what could I do? Brother, she insisted on going ahead with it. The child will have her share of suffering, I'm afraid. They've not been married long, don't forget, replied Lady Wang. We must hope that time will sort things out for them. She suddenly laughed. What's the joke? Asked Jiajing. Oh, I just remembered some nonsense of Bao Yu's. He came here first thing this morning specially to talk to me about Ingchen. Oh yes? What did he have to say? Lady Wang gave a humorous account of her early morning interview with Bao Yu, and of his brilliant plan, which despite himself Jiajing found rather amusing. Speaking of Bao Yu, he said, in a more serious tone, the boy spends all his time loafing about in the garden, it simply won't do. With one's daughters, well, one has one's disappointments, I realize, but in the long run girls get married and leave the family anyway. With a son, however, it is totally different. If he should fall by the wayside, the whole future of the family could be threatened. It so happens that only the other day a friend recommended a tutor, a widely read scholar, a man of the highest principles, and what is more, a southerner like ourselves. But I have come to the conclusion that southerners are altogether too easygoing for the boys up here in the capital, who misbehave themselves abominably, and are most of them smart enough to get by without having to do a stroke of work. They're a bumptious breed to begin with, and if their teacher mollycoddles them, and is not prepared to take them down a peg or two, it's a waste of everyone's time. That is why it has never been a family practice to engage outside tutors, and why we have always had a member of the clan, an older man, with a decent smattering of culture of course, to run the school. Diru, the present preceptor, may be rather a mediocre scholar, but he's certainly an effective disciplinarian, and sees to it that the work gets done. Bao Yu's present state of idleness is thoroughly unsatisfactory, and in my opinion the best solution would be for him to resume his studies at the family school. I agree with you entirely, said Lady Wang. Since your last posting he has been constantly ill, and what with one thing and another has fallen a long way behind with his studies. I think the routine of going to school would do him good. Jiajing nodded, and they continued chatting for a while longer. Little time was lost. The very next day, as soon as Bao Yu was up and had finished washing and combing his hair, a deputation of pages arrived and sent in the message, Serging wishes to see Master Bao. Hurriedly tidying his clothes, Bao Yu went straight over to his father's study. He paid his morning respects and stood to attention. Tell me, Jiajing began, what you have been doing recently in the way of work. A fair amount, were you going to say? A very magnum opus of your worthless doodling, no doubt. I have observed you of late. Your idleness goes from strength to strength. I am also constantly hearing of some new ailment of yours, or shall we rather say ingenious pretext to play truant. I trust one find you fully recovered? Another thing, I gather you spend the greater part of your time fooling around with your cousins in the garden, and that even the maidservants are permitted to participate in your infantile antics. Isn't it time you grew up and acquired a little self-esteem? You must understand that those verses you write are not going to impress anyone. The only thing the examiners are interested in is a well-written composition. And the effort you have expended in that direction has so far been non-existent. Now listen carefully to what I have to say. From today, I want you to forget all about your verses and couplets. You are to concentrate exclusively on octopartite compositions. I will give you 12 months' grace. If by the end of that time you are still in your present unregenerate state, you may as well give up altogether, and I for my part shall have to think again about owning a creature like you as my son. He summoned Li Gui. Inform Tea Leaf that he is to take Bao Yu first thing tomorrow morning to collect the required textbooks, and then bring them here for my inspection. I shall be accompanying him to school myself. Turning to Bao Yu. Off with you, he trumpeted. I shall expect you early tomorrow morning. Bao Yu returned to Green Delights, where Aroma was anxiously awaiting him. The pleasure with which she received the news of his renewed course of study contrasted strangely with the incredulous horror that had rendered him speechless while in Jia Zheng's presence, and that now prompted him to send an urgent message through to grandmother Jia, begging her to intervene. She sent for him at once and said, "You should give it a try, my darling. You don't want to anger your father. Don't worry. Remember, I shall always be here if you need me." There was nothing for it but to go back and give the maids their instructions. "Wake me at the crack of dawn, as father will be waiting to take me to school." Aroma and Musk took it in turns to stay awake that night. In the morning Aroma woke Bao Yu punctually, helped him wash, comb his hair and dress, and sent a junior maid out with instructions for Tea Leaf to wait with the books at the inner gate. She had to spur him on a couple of times before finally he left and made his way towards the study. On his way he stopped to inquire if Serging had arrived yet, and was informed by a page from the study that one of the literary gentlemen had just called, but had been kept waiting outside, as the master was still in his dressing room. This calmed Bao Yu's nerves a little, and he proceeded on to the inner sanctum. As luck would have it, a servant was at that very moment coming out on his way to fetch him, so he went straight in. After another brief homily, Jiajing led the way and father and son took a carriage to the school, Tea Leaf following with the books. A lookout had been posted and Diaryu had been alerted and was standing in readiness for the party's arrival. Before the old man could come forward to greet him, however, Jiajing walked into the schoolroom and paid his respects. Diaryu took him by the hand and inquired politely after Lady Jia. Bao Yu then went up and paid his respects. Jiajing remained standing throughout, and insisted on waiting until Diaryu was seated before sitting down himself. "I have come here today," he began, "because I felt the need to entrust my son to you personally, and with a few words of instruction. He is no longer a child, and if he is to shoulder his responsibilities, and earn a place in the world, it is high time he applied himself conscientiously to preparing for his exams. At home, unfortunately, he spends all his time idling about in the company of children. His verses, the only field in which he has acquired any competence, are for the most part turgid juvenilia, at their best romantic trifles devoid of substance." "And he looks such a fine lad," interposed Diaryu. "He seems so intelligent. Why this refusal to study, this perverse streak of hedonism? Not that one should entirely neglect poetic composition. But there is surely time enough for that later on in one's career." "Precisely," said Jiajing. "For the present I would humbly suggest a course of reading and exegesis of primary scriptural texts, and plenty of compositions. If he should show the least sign of being a recalcitrant pupil, I earnestly beseech you to take him in hand, and in so doing to save him from a shallow and wasted life." On this note he rose, and with a bow and a few parting remarks took his leave. Diaryu accompanied him to the door. "Please convey my respects to Lady Jia." "I will," said Jiajing, and climbed into his carriage. When Diaryu returned to the classroom, Bao Yu was already sitting at a small rosewood desk in the southwest corner of the room, by the window. He had 2 sets of texts and a meager-looking volume of model compositions stacked in a pile on his right. Tea Leaf was instructed to put his paper, ink, brush and inkstone away in the drawer of the desk. "I understand you have been ill, Bao Yu," said Diaryu. "I hope you are quite recovered?" Bao Yu rose to his feet. "Quite recovered, thank you, sir. We must see to it that you apply yourself with zeal from now on. Your father is most insistent that you should do well. Start by revising the texts you have already memorized. Your timetable will be as follows: Preprandium, general revision. Postprandium, calligraphy. Meridianum, exegesis. And conclude the day's work by reciting quietly to yourself a few model compositions. That should do for the time being." "Yes, sir." As Bao Yu sat down again, he glanced around him. Most of the old faces from the Zhoukijin days were gone, and in their place were quite a few new boys. He reflected on their exceptionally boorish appearance, and the face of Qin Zhong came suddenly into his mind. Since the death of his friend there had been no one to keep him company in his studies, no one to share his innermost thoughts. He was overwhelmed with a sense of grief and loneliness, and sat silently staring at his books. Not long afterwards Diru came over to say that as this was his first day he could leave early. "Tomorrow," he said, "I shall go through a passage with you. On second thoughts, to do justice to your natural intelligence, I should like you to expound a passage or two for me. That will give me a clearer idea of the sort of work you have been doing, and the standard you have reached." Bao Yu's heart was already thumping. But to learn how he fared the following day, you must read the next chapter.